Good morning. I'm speaking to you from the unceded land of the Dena'ina in Anchorage, Alaska. I would like all of us to take a moment to honor and acknowledge the indigenous people who have inhabited and been caretakers of this land and thank them for their past, present, and future care of the land, rivers, mountains, and animals. Ted and I would also like to thank Shelley Euler, BJ Farrar, and the organizers of this conference for allowing us to present this paper. We will be sharing the damage that occurred to the Anchorage Museum almost 2 years ago and highlight some insights we gained from that disaster. Much of what we share today includes shocking images, not meant to pass blame, but rather to focus on what we can learn and how we can prepare better for the future. I'll set the stage and then we'll jump into the mounts and sort of the things that we learned. Anchorage is the largest city in Alaska. With the surrounding communities, it houses almost 400,000 of the over 700,000 people that live in Alaska. Although small in numbers as compared to other urban centers in the U.S., the land area that Anchorage encompasses is larger than expected. Although the scale of spaces in Anchorage and in Alaska is large, we do not have the high population density of other urban centers. The Anchorage Museum is one of the main draws downtown for both our community and for tourists. The 247,000 square foot building consists of 5 different buildings or additions. They are merged to appear as one museum from the inside, but each addition was built under different standards and with different materials. The museum opened in 1968 and opened additions in 1975, 1985, 2009, and 2017, along with major renovations of many of the older spaces. Today, there are almost 80,000 square feet of exhibition space. Our mission is to connect people, expand perspectives, and encourage global dialogue about the North and its distinct environment. The museum welcomes over 200,000 visitors, including 20,000 children, through camps, classes, and school trips. It serves its statewide mission by organizing and presenting programs and exhibitions in Anchorage, as well as by traveling exhibitions throughout the globe. The museum endeavors to serve the widest possible audience and to provide a cultural center where all of Alaska's cultures feel welcome. With a staff of under 70, the museum presents and hosts more than 1,000 programs and events each year, offering a wide spectrum of culturally diverse programming. We present and curate about 20 exhibits each year, giving particular focus to the art, culture, history, and science of the North. The facility includes galleries for exhibitions of our permanent collection as well as borrowed exhibits, the Imaginarium Discovery Center with hands-on science exhibits, the Thomas Planetarium, and the Smithsonian Institution's Arctic Studies Center and the Atwood Resource Center, which provides free access to the museum's archives and library collections. The museum cares for a large variety of collections typical of municipal museums around the country. We're caretakers of 27,000 individual objects and artworks. This includes a survey of visual arts in Alaska from the 18th century to the present, with an especially strong collection of indigenous art. We house objects of daily life of Athabaskan, Inupiaq, Yupik, St. Lawrence Island Yupik, Sugpiaq, Anungan, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian peoples. Our archives house over 800,000 historical and documentary photographs featuring images from the late 19th century to the present. Furthermore, the museum has an ongoing partnership with the Smithsonian Institution, displaying 600 objects from the National Museum of the American Indian and the National Museum of Natural History. At 8:30 in the morning on November 30th, 2018, a 7.1 magnitude earthquake rocked the Anchorage area. It was centered about 8 to 10 miles north of downtown Anchorage. It lasted under a minute, but felt much longer. About 5 minutes later, a 5.7 magnitude earthquake occurred. These two events together caused the most immediate damage reported nationally. Areas of the building were damaged unequally. Some areas had significant damage, while others had minimal. The most damage was from fallen ceiling tiles and unsecured items in personnel offices. One of the ceiling tiles in our newly renovated Alaska exhibition fell and hit a sprinkler head, causing it to release. I'm going to skip the details related to the work done around the building to clean and prepare the museum for staff to return and for the public opening. It was a monumental undertaking, and of the staff allowed to work, most worked 12-hour days or more. Without the extensive work done by janitorial, security, facilities, exhibits, and collection staff, we would not have been able to open the museum 4 days after the earthquake. Instead, with the remaining time, we're going to focus on mounts and what we learned from this event. We had newly made mounts, older mounts, bulky ones, minimalist ones, the full range to analyze. Prior to this earthquake, both Ted and I approached mounts by focusing on the object or the artwork. Now, however, we also consider the building and all the connectors between the object and the ground. For a wall-mounted object, it matters if the wall is an exterior wall, structural, temporary, and which floor it actually is on. For deck-mounted objects, similar questions are important. Which floor, which building addition, is the pedestal secured or weighted? How far from the floor is the object? All these need to be considered. In fact, they seem to be as important as whether a mount is minimal and just cradles an object, or if it grips the object and restrains it. In the image that you see now, these are temporary galleries on the first floor. Objects in the pedestals are about 30 inches from the floor did move, well, those without mounts, such as baskets or small beaded sculptures, while heavier objects closer to the floor did not move. These two ceramic sculptures on the right surprisingly did not fall. Their bases are not attached to the parts above, and we're unsure why they were unharmed, but we assume it's because they are on a low platform and not on a higher pedestal. In this image, on the left, there's a temporary gallery on the third floor, or this is the temporary gallery on the third floor of the 2009 edition, which moves quite a bit during earthquakes. These weighted pedestals are not secured since it's a temporary gallery, and we found that the cases moved very little. But the same was also true of small objects, though we had expected more displacement. In the newly renovated Alaska exhibition, which is on the second floor of the 85 building, the cases were all bolted to the concrete floor. This was something that was the renovation in 2017. And the objects in these cradle mounts did not move at all, which was kind of what we had expected. So in the case of the ivory pieces that you see in this image, one of the things we noted is that sometimes restricting an object can also cause more damage if the mount is one of those really unobtrusive mounts where it's just cradling an object. So in this case, you can see where these are minimalist mounts, and the two sets of pickle forks and letter openers, they just have little cradles. There's nothing restricting anything from jumping out of the mount, and they're just these little U's. But because the whole mount could move, we don't see the kind of damage, which next to it you see these umbrella handles, which actually had mounts that, you know, when we tested them out, really protected the umbrella handles. But with the violence of this earthquake and the fact that the acrylic base was double-side taped to the glass below, which we thought would benefit the umbrella handles since they're so top-heavy, actually worked against us. And so then the movement of those very tall objects, they came out, and we fixed that since then, but we have thought about that a lot. And so in this other mount that Ted just made recently, we kind of applied that same principle.
It's on a cradle system. That consideration is to make as much full contact around the sides of the kayak without going up and over and getting an exact fit. And because of the different shape, you can't really see underneath the kayak. It was important to really reach that optimum contact point. The other important thing was to tie in both cradles with a connection 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch brass square plate, and that stabilizes those 2 points. The whole idea was to set it up where if it was going to move around, it was going to move on one point, which actually has the whole base. The whole
base will move rather than two different posts.
Separate points, yes.
Separate points that would then move independently of each other. But we found with these lighter objects that aren't in danger of moving great distances in the earthquake, that if it actually, it can move with the earthquake. By allowing a little flexibility, you actually limit the kind of damage that you might see. And so in this case, we just have placed the mount on the deck.
Because the kayak is not adhered, yes, the kayak is not going to necessarily bounce out of the cradle. It's going to slide a little bit back and forth in movement before. I just don't see earthquakes jumping things out of their mouths.
And this goes back to what I was talking about earlier about the knowing your building, because really that's where we found where objects jumped is it had to do with what it was sitting on. We still don't think objects jump out of their mouths. There's usually something else that's at play. It's the juncture of the building to the case, whether it's external wall, interior wall. It's been really working towards our favor to have this
movement to allow the kayak to move.
As we mentioned earlier, knowing what type of wall can matter. It might seem obvious, but in our fast exhibit changing environment, some of our temporary walls are weighted, or as in this case, we thought this temporary wall, which is actually full of small exhibit cases, was tied to a structural, either the ceiling or the floor or the structural wall behind it. Sadly, we discovered this wall was not secured to any of that structure except for at the bottom. And so what we discovered with all the objects that were in these individual cases, which were stone and low-fired ceramic lamps, they moved from front to back at least twice. And considering the damage we saw on the plexi fronts of these cases, we know that they did do this, sometimes more than twice. And for the future, because of that, we now require every single object in these cases to be mounted or have a specific mount to restrain it. The next exhibition that we had in this wall or in this space centered around cameras. And so luckily, because we had talked about the earthquake and the implications with this wall, Ted was able to implement some of his ideas, which he'll share now.
Some situations have more than just one object. In this case, there's 3 cameras that normally, possibly, they would have just been placed on the plinth. Yeah, they're just basically tabs, which is 1/4 inch brass on a 1/8 inch round bar that's placed at locations front, side, and back, to assist in the aesthetics that, of course, have been painted out. Placement of those tabs are critical so that there's contact on all 4 tabs on each camera. And actually, the shape of the object dictates that it's very difficult for me to see this camera tilting up or back, but I can see it going left or right, and that's why you have longer tabs on the sides than you do in the front. Well, this is a case where the camera is very tall and narrow compared to some of the other 35 millimeters that we have. And if you look back if you think about the box cameras that we looked at in the tabs, this particular camera obviously needed higher tabs, longer tabs. So I did put 2 in the front here, 1 on each side, and there's 2 in the back. So it's very stable, and because it's so tall, it was necessary to use the higher tabs in this situation. For the Brownie movie camera here, I utilized the tripod contact, and when I was asked to make mounts for all these cameras that had that capability, I wanted to know if I could utilize that, which I could. It was accepted, and it allowed me to make, in this particular case in the Brownie, a long base, and then that's screwed to the camera with the 1/4-20. Of course, everything's felted off. And then I was able, in this situation, to raise a stem to the center of that base plate, which then gets inserted into the tube.
And one of the nice things about the Brownie that you did is you could have just done tabs and had this on the deck, but by doing this, you were able to elevate it and give it some more presence. And from a curatorial perspective, that was desirable. And so sometimes we do just put things on the deck because of time, and we don't have the ability to make these individual mounts. And an individual mount that would have gripped this entire camera might have taken much longer. But by utilizing that point, you were able to efficiently do all the 40 cameras that are in this particular exhibition.
The luxuries of these mounts for these cameras is that it's a mechanical application, and that makes it more efficient in my opinion, as well as gives it that presence you're talking about. You can elevate it more.
So on this mount, which it's really nice to be able to in the same principle with the cameras, you can utilize safe holes and other items that are on the mask, which people have been doing for many, many years, but I really like this new system you've set up. Do you want to describe it, Ted?
I wanted to utilize the holes where the straps were, but I've seen hooks and other designs. I just thought of this tab on a post that could be, that would be through the holes where the original straps are located on the mast, and it's seated in a good tubing that allows me to get a lot of threads in the tubing to capture the post off of the tab, and the holes dictate, how big or what the diameter of your post is going in there.
Well, I also like that you put suede on the, obviously to protect the contact point from the brass to the mask.
This whole system is based on this cross piece that holds the the sides of the mast together, and then there is this additive extension off the tube that reaches down to the inside of the chin, and that is formed to match exactly where that point of contact is. That is then set up where another tube allows for a drop clip to be utilized, so the object itself, the mast, can be moved half an inch to an inch at most
away from the wall.
Away from the wall,
if we
depending
decide we need more. But I really like the fact that the mount is gripping the mask, and we don't have to worry about having the mask come out of the mount. Oftentimes you see on masks, you'll see the tabs come around to the front.
Right.
To hold the object has to dictate it, because the holes on this mask, which is a contemporary mask, are quite stable, and the wood is quite stable.
Exactly. Yeah. If you came across an artifact mask where that couldn't be utilized, obviously that's something to think about. But I think for stable masks, this kind of system for me is very direct and minimal.
In the Smithsonian Gallery, which is in the 2009 edition on the second floor, the mounts hold each object and attach to vertical rods under tension. In this gallery, no objects fell. During the planning of this exhibit, there was testing of vibration transfer and to make certain that the mounts hold the objects securely during an earthquake. They were extremely successful for this. As you can see, some of the mounts blend right in, and some are apparent to the visitor and can seem a bit bulky. The mounts were not removed after the earthquake, though there was some work done in the gallery. And as the conservators who worked on this project and worked with the casework, which was actually the problem, we're all interested to see what effects of these mounts, these more bulky mounts, will have on these objects. But also these mounts have held these objects, or by the end of this exhibition, for a minimum of 12 years and perhaps longer. We'll end here so that we can all join in a discussion about these and other mounts while thinking or addressing issues around earthquake mitigation. Chanan to all the Anchorage Museum staff members who made this presentation possible and helped during the disaster. And Chanan to all of you for listening to our experiences and our thoughts and joining us in the conversation to come.
Okay, so the first question is, for these small object mounts like the cameras, how did you secure the bases that rest on the case? Did you allow for movement or make the bases rigid in the cases?
So the cases themselves have those little bases in there that are sort of restrained and minimally they can move, and that we think might help a little bit when the bigger wall moves, because that was one of the things that we found is that the pedestals that were restrained in a space that is moving a lot, all the transfer went up to the object, and then the object was the point at which most of the momentum continued. And so you kind of had a whip effect with the objects, and we were trying to avoid that, which is kind of what we were trying to describe with the ivory pieces. By having the whole thing move a little bit, you restrict it from all the transfer of energy that goes to the end of the object. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you, Monica. That's great. I've actually got a couple of questions. Can you talk a little bit more about that vibration testing that you were talking about happened in the gallery that had the NMAI objects? Can you explain that process?
Sure. I wish I could remember more. It was about 10 years ago or more. Michelle Austin Dennehy, who is a conservator, was contracted at the time through the National Museum of Natural History and the National Museum of American Indian to test the vibration that might occur in those cases, because they specifically were concerned about those rods that all the brackets that then the mounts attach to. So there's a lot of points, and there's a lot of concern that if things come into resonance and how tight the rods are and how much vibration transfer would occur from one rod to another. And so I can't remember the name of the sort of, it's not a data logger, but it's a vibration logger that we utilized, and we put them on the rods and then put them on the brackets so that they kind of imitated what an object would be, and then we tested it. We're lucky because that side of the building does not get a lot of car traffic or truck traffic, so we don't have to worry about vibration, low-level vibration that you might see in bigger cities. And even, throughout the building, we didn't have that. But Michelle could speak more to that, and I think contacting her would probably be the best. But what they discovered is that some of their concerns weren't necessary at the time, but now that we've had this really large earthquake, I think it's different, because I think at the time we thought if we had an earthquake this large, there'd be bigger issues. There might be, not in that building, but in the rest of the museum, that there could be concerns or issues that were probably more personal safety and building safety related. And so if the building is failing, I think, worrying about the objects, they become not as important, frankly. But we try to do the best we can, and so we were trying to limit anything that would happen in that building, which had some of the best building specs that were available at the time for earthquakes, and it did. It really, but the building does sway a lot. I mean, it probably moves at least a foot at the top on the fourth floor during that earthquake. Minimally, it probably moved more than a foot. I think some of the estimates for other buildings in Anchorage that are a similar height and how much they moved were over a foot in distance. The buildings swaying. I think they were up to 4 feet movement at like 10 floors or so or higher. Wow.
My heart goes out. I think it's just, wow, just going through something like that is just awful, I think. And yeah, I feel for everyone who's had to go through something like that. And you're right, people come first and then our objects. But yeah, wow, thanks for sharing that. There's a question back here that goes back to the camera display, and it's the camera tabs are very nicely done, so there's a lovely compliment then. But the person's asking, did you consider brazing soldering a flattened rod to the bottom end of the flattened tab instead of onto the face?
Did that make sense, Ted?
I'm going to try to figure that out. The braised rod is going where?
Sorry, that question's just disappeared. Let me go back to that one.
I'm sorry.
I think they meant, Ted, like on the bottom of the tab rather than so that, you've made some of those tabs before where it appears flat above the deck, and the rod only goes into the deck.
Right. And so the question.
So they're saying, did you consider brazing or soldering a flattened rod to the bottom end of the flattened tab instead of onto the face?
Oh, okay. Well, structurally, I found it stronger if I can get a little purchase on the tab, and the round is sanded down where it becomes almost like a half rod. I just find it stronger because I have a little more brazing surface to work with versus just this rod brazed at the very end of that tab. I see where it's going, where it's just like a flat tab going down versus you see this round bar or half round bar going in. But structurally, I think I found it stronger because you could actually bend that at that point It's just my technique.
Yep. Thanks, Ted. There's another question here from Kimberly, and it says, did you have any objects secured with wax? And if so, how did that work? And did you have any, or did you tie any of the objects to mounts with monofilament for extra security? And if so, did it cause any damage or keep anything safe?
So we do have, in that exhibition where the ivory pickle forks and letter openers, you couldn't see, but that entire case, I don't know, it has like 50 pieces of ivory, and pretty much 3/4 of the ivory in that case are all secured with wax because it's on a glass shelf. So there was no opportunity to drill, which is why we had those other mounts on acrylic rather than directly into the shelf. And then we had some up on the 3rd floor as well in those really tiny cases that I showed photos of, tiny pedestal cases. And the wax, I would say, is all about the application and the person who's making it. And the wax does not have good shear strength. And so if you make the ball and then you squish it too much, you don't have good strength. But we had those small items. I think only 2 or 3 of those ivory figurines moved. Everything else stayed. And so the wax worked out really well. And we can't use it for all walrus ivory, because if it's older walrus ivory that's decayed, you can't use the wax on it. And you need a mount. But for some of the, the good ivory, that worked. And then for the question about monofilament, as a conservator, I'm really not a big fan of monofilament. For some of the organic and the kinds of objects that we see up here in Alaska, I should say that I deal with a lot of organic materials up here. We're a contemporary art museum as well, so we have lots of different materials, but I find the monofilament to be a little cutting, and so oftentimes we'll use other materials, and then Ted has tubing, or we have medical tubing, or different kinds of polyethylene tubing, shrink tubing that we will put around it to keep it. And in this situation in 2018, we didn't have any that we could judge, but we have done that in the past where we have secured with additional either coated wire or thread or other things that might not be as strong as monofilament. But I don't know, Ted, if you wanted to say.